So I wanted to address the is cloud too expensive and talk about the whole repatriation movement as well. And this kind of whatever talk or video is based loosely on an article or a blog post that I wrote called 13 Reasons Why Your AWS Bill is So High. Let me start with a little bit of background. I mean, how did we get here? It seemed to take forever to get into the cloud. And in the beginning, I remember having a sales manager who said, like, there's no way I'm putting my important client data in a online CRM. That company could steal my data. And it went from that. And I remember having a law firm customer who actually wouldn't even consider co-location at some point. They said, no, it's in our secure, basement server room. There's no way we would even put it in colo. And so it really did take some time for like this whole cloud thing to catch on. But then once it did, it kind of went gangbusters. And so let me start with the first topic is, are costs high because cloud providers are nefarious? And I would just say the quick answer is no. They're not nefarious, but at the same time, if you're coming to a cloud provider and you're like, hey, we're interested in coming to you and here's our workload, we're coming in, we're going to do a lift and shift. I mean, you would have like a rash of firings if you had, that original sales, crew with a sales engineer say, well, this workload's like kind of big, it doesn't fit, you're going to have to overspec your instances, it's not efficient in the cloud. They're going to say, oh yeah, it's great, lift and shift over, and you can fix it up, over time. So let me start with the first reason why cloud costs are really high, and that I feel in a lot of instances people are just choosing the wrong product in AWS, or really I should stop really picking on AWS. It really could be just any public cloud, but you can just go through the list of all the different AWS products or Azure products, and you'll find storage. And it's very tempting to say, well, here's storage or here's backup, and to stop on it and to do it. And again, this is for someone who's not trained in those platforms, doesn't have the certs. So you scroll through, and for instance, you can use like an S3 Deep Glacier, for some kind of archival use. A poster on a subreddit for, I think it was for AWS, and he had said like, hey, is my math right? I want to back up my NAS to S3 Glacier, and the way I'm computing it, it's coming up to $43,000 of one-time cost, and then it's a mere pittance of like $43 a month thereafter. And sure enough, when you run his formula through, because he had a bunch of small little files, all those puts and gets just added up, and it literally was an enormous task to put that into S3 Glacier. But once it's there, it wasn't that bad of a thing. In that person's case, maybe it would have been better to look at Snowball, but there's other products within AWS that might have been better. So really choosing just the wrong AWS product. Kind of the second point is what I call like shifting incompatible workloads to AWS. And it's kind of unfair for me to look at the enterprise stack and say like it's incompatible. But really when you look at it in the enterprise workload, I mean, those apps are older, they're legacy apps, and they just hold RAM, they hold CPU, and they're not designed to let it go. So that whole elasticity of the cloud is just meaningless for these enterprise apps. And so you have an app and it just occupies space, and the benefit of cloud, especially with these startups where it's like two founders in a basement, one of them's like, hey, I got this great idea, and they're coding it up in Git and they want to see it live, and one of them just slices a credit card into AWS or Azure or whatever, and they're up and running. The beauty of it is you could buy compute in bite-sized pieces. 20 years ago, those two founders in the basement would have to have just kind of built it on like some machines in their house or their office somewhere and tested it, and then they're like, okay, well now we got to deploy it, we got to go buy data center space, we got to call like our VAR and get hardware. We're good at coding, but I don't know how to set up Apache or Nginx or any of that, load balancing. And so bite-sized pieces, that's where the cloud excels. And when you just take these monolithic workloads into the cloud, they're just expensive. Another issue that we're seeing a lot is just no billing alarms. It's a simple tool. It's free through the various public cloud providers, but these have to be set, and the thresholds have to be really well thought out and architected. It's if you see like a percentage of change or some kind of like dollar threshold, that's important. Some low-hanging fruit for, it's like the next thing is choosing what I call choosing the wrong AWS billing option. So you are in AWS or you're in Azure and you have this monolithic app and you know that your app is going to hold these resources and that like your baseline is a certain set amount. It just makes sense to do what's called a reserved instance, where you prepay for like a 1 or 3 year term, and you're just telling them like, hey, you can count on my revenue because I need these servers all the time. I'm not going to turn them off because they're core to our business. And for that, you save money as opposed to like what like AWS calls a spot instance or an on-demand instance. Of course, different public cloud providers call it different things. Next item, and this is again loosely based on my 13 reasons why your AWS bill is so high. I call this one overly large infrastructure, and this has kind of been a recurring theme through me talking about this. But again, if you're just massive, if you have a lot of historical data, lots of storage, lots of compute, you're a SaaS, you just get to the point where you should probably bring this in-house. And then I've spoken about this a couple times, and people sometimes will laugh that I always make these analogies, but it's like living in an apartment and you have city water running and it's great for washing dishes and showering. But if you tear that apartment down and you turn it into a farm, the city water, you just can't buy enough. Although it's super convenient to turn the tap on and have a bunch of water come out, and you turn it off and your sewage is taken care of as well. But at that point, like if you're running a farm, you need to start exploring like wells. And of course, wells are, there's big CapEx and there's maintenance, and it's not easy, and you need specialized expertise, and you can't just, call the city and say, hey, why is my water not on? And so just what I call overly large infrastructure. Another thing, and it's not necessarily maybe why a public cloud bill is high, but I think there was like this misguided pressure to adopt public cloud, where it was like, this is what you should do, this is what everyone should do, this is like the modern way to deploy your applications. And I just think that every business is different. Yes, you have like this nimble, born on cloud infrastructure, it's Kubernetes, it's container based, it can scale up and down. Yes, absolutely public cloud. And even to a certain point, it might need to be revisited as that app gets tremendously huge, or you have like a huge amount of clients coming, or your storage gets absolutely, out of control, into the petabytes. And at that point, you have to start, looking at using other clouds, or maybe some kind of direct connect back to an on-premise facility. I mean, you could get a lot of bang for your buck from hardware and storage options these days. My next point in that blog article was, I called it AWS is complicated. And so this could easily be tied into like you're buying the wrong product, but in really the public cloud, they have a lot of features, and there's a lot of DevOps expertise and a lot of thought that goes into that. And more, it's less of an infrastructure as a service and more of as a platform as a service. And so there's certain ways to use that product. For instance, you're doing S3 storage, and you have certain files that you have to keep for a certain amount of time, or you have, let's say you're a software company and you have iterations of your software that come out for download, and you want to put it in S3, so you have like this this S3 bucket, and you have this global coverage so anyone in any country can download it. Well, if you're at version 13 and version 1 and 2 are still like in like an S3 bucket somewhere, I mean, you're paying full boat for all those iterations. I mean, there has to be some type of automated curation of files and instances. And so it takes nuance. It's really hard to kind of lift and shift out of like on-prem into the public cloud, and then just know all the tools that these product people have put in there to make life better for you. It's hard to realize them. And this is kind of a tangent as well, but in the cloud, maybe I should go and update the blog article, but in the cloud, it's designed to be used a certain way, and that certain way hasn't been done for very long. Yes, we've been in the cloud for 20 years, but we still haven't really refined our usage. We still don't know exactly what we're doing. Here's a great example. On-prem, when you were on-prem and you had all your servers running, you had your database servers, you had your storage, you were doing backups. And they were on-premise, and they were probably to disk for a point. But then they were written to tape, and the tapes were rotated to like an Iron Mountain off-site. I mean, we didn't do that because we just thought tape, technology was amazing, or we just loved tape. We did it because we had no choice in the cost. Back in the day, if you'd kept all that stuff on disk, it just would have taken up so much cash. And so tape, you do get a lot of bang for your buck. And so for that, the technology is amazing. So you rotate that off-site and you save a ton of money. Whereas in the cloud, it's just open. You can just keep it all on disk, and you can keep it all on fast disk, and you can keep it on disk that's replicated all over the planet unnecessarily. I mean, maybe you keep that stuff for a while, and then you put it in an S3 bucket that's only in one facility, and then it goes to Glacier, and then it's just completely deleted after a certain point. And these are just some of those nuances we're not doing, but that kind of all speaks to the point as AWS, Azure, they're complicated. Over provisioning, we used to, during the .com, aging myself, but during the .com boom, you would run into a startup and I would say, what kind of traffic are you seeing? And they would say, well, we might have one user, we might have like 1 million concurrent users, depending on how marketing does, we have this big event. And so you were stuck doing something called building to peak, or build to peak. And so you were building an infrastructure to accommodate the worst case scenario possible as far as like traffic. And if you had a bunch of engineers designing something, they would catch flack for having the site go down, but they wouldn't necessarily catch flack for having like $100,000 a month bill. So they would build a peak and it would handle the load. Whether or not they got that load or not was a different question. But we still kind of have that issue in public cloud. We still will round up our instances because we don't have auto scaling, or we can't scale up and down. We're still terrified to put like a T1 micro instance out there. Like, oh my gosh, one processor or just this little bit of RAM, it's going to crash. But because we don't have it scaling up, we just over provision out of the gate just to be safe. And that runs up our bills. So moving on to the next point is, I called it, you are paying a margin. And so you have a margin that you're paying, and to AWS or Azure. I mean, AWS in 2024, I think they had a 38% operating margin on their AWS cloud service. And, internally, on-prem, I don't know, maybe you had some cost centers, but I don't see anyone internally marking up things by 38, 40%. So you do have a margin. Moving on to the next one, I call this one prioritization of security over cost. And this is a thing where you catch a lot of heat if your app gets hacked, and you catch a lot of heat if your site is down. So site reliability, security are paramount right now, and they absolutely need to be and should be, but no one's really looking at the cost. And if I were an engineer and I kept it up and running for years and I kept it secure for years, and someone was like bugging me about cost, I'm like, hey, I've kept it up and running, I don't even see the bill, I'm doing the best I can, but yeah, do you want it to go down or not? And so we do lack, and this is actually the next section in the article, was like what I called it, lack of curation. And so lack of curation is really someone coming up behind DevOps and coming up behind site reliability engineering and behind security and really behind IT in general, and looking at like tagging within AWS, looking at orphaned instances, tagging something for dev, and then maybe having something where every 30 days, every dev instance is reviewed, or you look at the utilization of it and you just delete them, or certain departments have tags or certain people have tags. There's a lot of third-party tools that we could probably use to catch what I call low-hanging fruit, orphan instances, over-provisioned resources with AI. This is a lot easier these days. And then refining infrastructure, and really, again, this goes back to product know-how. It's like, what products are we buying that have like large data transfer costs? Or do we have to be paying those? Historically on-premise, if you had your stuff behind the firewall, I mean, there's really no limit to how you could move that stuff inside. I mean, 1 gigabit was really amazing in the early days. Then 10 gigabit wasn't that big of a deal, and now you have 25 gigabit and faster. 100 gigabit is costly but doable behind the firewall inside of a data center. I don't know. I think every organization would probably need to have some kind of spending manager, but it's tough. It's really tough for IT managers. I feel for them. There was a lot of impetus to get into the cloud. The education system is training people in college to have certain certs for public cloud providers because it is relevant. I mean, it's not irrelevant, but they come in and then you fall into ecosystems where you're like, well, I understand Azure really well. I'd prefer that we build this in Azure, or I was with an AWS shop and I understand that. I'd like to keep it there. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to do what's best for the business, and that's super important. Yes, it would be, in a perfect world, we could externalize a lot of responsibilities like we do with payroll, and externalize those responsibilities, and we just log in on console and it's all in the cloud. There's no physical tactile piece to it. We're not dealing with like renting trucks or shipping gear or replacing hard drives or bad cabling or cross connects. It's just all there, and there's a big push for that. But I think that's for the right type of company. I think that's for companies that built the app for cloud to begin with. And then even those companies, I think, can scale to a certain level and then have to really start making some hard decisions as they have millions of clients in there. Can they really afford it? If you're putting, for instance, if you're putting storage into public cloud, if you're not using object storage, I mean, you probably in the 7 to 10 cents per gig per month realm. I mean, that puts at 8 cents, that puts your petabyte at $80,000 a month. And you haven't backed it up, you haven't secured it, you haven't done anything with it. So I think in the end of the day, there's really no silver bullet on where your stuff should live or who should host it. But I think we have to start looking at what's best for the business. And although it's very inconvenient, again, no one likes to do payroll, but it might need to come back in-house. And so this repatriation thing is not like hype or spin. It's just something where in the early days with these big cloud bills, we saw it and we're like, yes, it's a big cloud bill, but we didn't have a CapEx. So you need to be quiet. We didn't have a CapEx. But then after a while, the numbers just got bigger and bigger. And you get to a point where you're like, well, I don't think the CapEx, I think this was more than the CapEx ever was. And now it's like recurring, and we're terrified to do anything with it. So hopefully this was helpful. And again, it wasn't to be negative with AWS or Azure. This is just the reality on the ground of workloads that are in the cloud that maybe either outgrow cloud or should have never been in the cloud in the first place.